June 9th, 1944, 7:22 in the morning. A Wehrmacht officer approaches with a white flag in hand. 700 soldiers standing behind him in formation. He's facing Sergeant Jake McNiece, 25 years old, mohawk shaved into his skull, face streaked with war paint. A disciplinary file thick enough to discharge him 8 times over, never rose above the rank of private, now encircled by enemy forces with just 35 men at his side, their food gone, water depleted, and the bridge they'd bled to take now a pile of twisted metal courtesy of their own flyboys. The German straightens his tunic and lays out the mathematics of the situation. McNiece's unit is isolated. No relief column coming, no supply lines, no avenue of retreat. Logic dictates one course of action: surrender. Jake surveys the 700 enemy troops, glances back at his 36 paratroopers, then presents the German with 3 paths forward. Path 1, withdraw your forces. Path 2, we negotiate terms. Path 3, launch your assault up this hill against entrenched machine gun nests, manned by soldiers who've been chewing grass for sustenance and are spectacularly angry about it. The Wehrmacht officer selects Path 3. 3 days pass. 700 German soldiers lie dead or maimed across the hillside. McNiece's 35 men suffer 0 losses. The US Army attempted to expel Jake McNiece 8 separate times during his training cycle. He shattered a staff sergeant's nose in a dispute over breakfast rations, emptied 2 military policemen's sidearms into roadside signage, refused to render salutes to commissioned officers, disregarded every regulation that didn't align with his personal code, and then he walked away from a transport plane that disintegrated at 1,500 feet on D-Day, defended a river crossing against battalion-strength forces with 36 fighters, parachuted into encircled Bastogne, and coordinated 247 aerial resupply missions while under constant enemy fire, before returning to Oklahoma to spend 4 decades working the counter at a post office. Jake McNiece never aspired to military service. His objectives were straightforward: eliminate Nazis, consume a decent meal, return to civilian life. The Army invested 4 years discovering that the only effective way to utilize Jake McNiece was to stop attempting to manage him. Understanding Jake McNiece requires grasping one fundamental truth. His hostility toward authority wasn't rooted in rebelliousness. He rejected authority because incompetent leadership gets soldiers killed, and he'd watched it happen. McNiece came of age during America's Great Depression in Oklahoma, one of 10 children in a family that survived through hunting, fishing, and trapping. By age 10, he was taking game for the family table. At 19, he was fighting fires professionally. When Pearl Harbor burned, he qualified for draft exemption. He enlisted anyway. Not from patriotic fervour, not from ideological opposition to fascism. Jake volunteered for airborne infantry because paratroopers deployed behind enemy lines carrying explosives and, using his exact phrasing, depriving the enemy of nice things. Fort Benning received him for basic training. His commanding officer inquired whether Jake grasped the concept of military discipline. Jake confirmed he did. Then, within his first 7 days, he engaged in hand-to-hand combat with a staff sergeant. The sergeant had confiscated Jake's butter portion at morning mess. Jake requested its return. The sergeant ordered him silent and told him to eat. Jake broke his nose. That same afternoon, Jake shattered the demolition course record, completing it faster than any recruit in Fort Benning's documented history. His commanding officer experienced simultaneous impressions, impressed and furious. Because Jake McNiece represented both the finest soldier in his training cohort and the most substantial disciplinary nightmare the Army had encountered. Jake refused to address officers as Sir unless they demonstrated competence worthy of the title, refused to salute during morning colours, refused to maintain attention, refused compliance with any regulation he deemed operationally pointless. When questioned about his inability to behave like a conventional soldier, Jake articulated his position with clarity. He'd enlisted to kill Nazis, not participate in what he characterized as the dog and pony show that is the United States military. Such an attitude should have resulted in immediate discharge. Instead, leadership made a brilliant tactical decision. They isolated him, gave Jake his own platoon, separate barracks, independent space, and whenever another insubordinate soldier appeared, someone incapable of following regulations but too lethal to discharge, They reassigned that soldier to Jake's platoon. Within 6 months, Jake commanded 12 men, every single one a disciplinary case, every single one an exceptional warfighter. They called themselves the Filthy 13. Each man arrived in Jake's unit for identical reasons: too valuable to discharge, too volatile to integrate with standard infantry. Jack Winmer, Pennsylvania Coal Country. Fought 3 MPs simultaneously over a poker dispute. Left all 3 with broken noses. Best marksman in the entire 101st Airborne Division. Charles Plaudeau, New York City. Italian immigrant fluent in 4 languages. Caught operating black market schemes selling military equipment to civilians. The army retained him because he could interrogate prisoners in German, Italian, French and English without translation. Robert Cohn, Tennessee, demolitions expert. Arrested for detonating a latrine because he wanted to observe the blast pattern. He was correct. It was fascinating. The army transferred him to Jake's platoon the following day. Joe Oleskiewicz, Chicago. Street fighter, boxing champion. 14 documented altercations during basic training. Won every single one. The army abandoned attempts at rehabilitation and sent him to Jake. Every man shared the same fundamental problem: inability to follow idiotic orders from mediocre officers. And every man was precisely the type of soldier Jake wanted on his team, because Jake understood something the institutional army missed. Discipline and obedience are not synonymous concepts. Obedience means executing commands without question. Discipline means accomplishing what needs accomplishing, regardless of difficulty. Jake's soldiers possessed discipline. They trained with greater intensity than any other unit. Superior marksmanship, faster running times, could ruck march for days without complaint. But they refused to waste time on parade formations, polished boots, and saluting officers who'd never experienced combat. Jake operated the Filthy 13 like a wolf pack. No unnecessary hierarchy, no arbitrary rules. One governing principle: demonstrate competence or get removed. If you could shoot, march, fight, and follow Jake into impossible tactical situations, you belonged. If you couldn't, Jake would remove you personally. The army despised it. Officers filed constant complaints, arguing Jake's platoon was undermining military order and discipline. Jake's response never varied. When conventional soldiers could outshoot, outmarch, and outfight his men, he'd consider adopting their regulations. That silenced most objections. The Filthy 13 became legendary at Fort Benning. Other soldiers observed them training, watched them demolish every physical standard the army established, watched them violate every social convention, and face zero consequences. Some officers wanted them court-martialed, others wanted to study them as a phenomenon. Most simply wanted them gone. But nobody could argue with results. When the 101st Airborne conducted qualification assessments, Jake's platoon scored highest in every category, every single time. Marksmanship, top scores. Demolitions, top scores. Hand-to-hand combat, Jake's men won every tournament. The only category they failed, uniform inspections, because none of them cared. Before deployment to England, Jake had one final encounter with military police. Jake and his men were drinking at an establishment near Fort Benning, off-duty, off-base, minding their business. 2 MPs entered and began harassing Jake's soldiers. One MP attempted to arrest one of Jake's men for intoxication and disorderly conduct. Jake stood, inquired if there was a problem. The MP ordered Jake to sit down and shut his mouth. Jake broke the MP's jaw, then broke the second MP's jaw. Then confiscated both Colt 1911 pistols, walked outside, and discharged all 16 rounds into a street sign. Then returned inside and waited for the MPs to regain consciousness so he could surrender himself properly. The MPs arrested Jake and delivered him to his commanding officer. The officer reviewed Jake's file. 8 disciplinary actions, multiple assaults, constant insubordination. He should have initiated court-martial proceedings immediately. Instead, he proposed a deal. There existed a record for ruck marching 136 miles from Fort Benning to another installation. Very few soldiers had ever completed it. If Jake and his men attempted the march, the officer would overlook the MP incident. Jake agreed, with one additional condition. He'd complete all 136 miles without changing his socks or developing a single blister. The commanding officer laughed, said it was physiologically impossible. Jake said, Watch me. 10 days later, Jake completed all 136 miles. Full combat gear, 60-pound ruck, no blisters, perfect feet. Army medical personnel couldn't comprehend it. Jake's explanation was elementary. He'd been walking and working since age 10. His feet were tougher than boot leather. The commanding officer honoured his word, dropped all charges. Jake and the Filthy 13 deployed to England in early 1944. Once in England, Jake's men immediately generated problems. The British maintained strict food rationing. No hunting, no fishing, absolutely no poaching on Crown property. Jake assessed the British rations, surveyed the countryside, observed deer, rabbits, pheasants. He began hunting with his Emifoine Garand, used military explosives for fishing, trapped rabbits using techniques learned in Oklahoma. Within weeks, Jake's platoon was eating superior food to the officers. They were also violating approximately 47 different British laws. A local landowner filed legal action against the US government, claiming American soldiers were illegally harvesting his game. Jake's commanding officer summoned him, asked if Jake was responsible. Jake confirmed. His men required proper nutrition if they were going to jump into France and kill Germans. The officer asked what Jake expected him to do. The lawsuit was serious. Jake looked at his commanding officer and said, "What are you threatening me with? An impossible jump into German-occupied territory?" Then Jake smiled, said he was enthusiastic about that prospect. The officer realized the strategic problem. You cannot threaten a man who volunteered for the most dangerous assignment in the military with additional danger. Jake avoided punishment again. June 5th, 1944. Jake McNiece and the Filthy 13 prepared to jump into Normandy. Jake had painted his face with white war stripes, given himself a mohawk haircut. Some of his men had shaved their heads completely bald. A Stars and Stripes photographer observed them, captured images. Those photographs became the most iconic images of D-Day paratroopers, the ones reproduced in every World War II documentary you've ever watched. That's Jake McNiece, the man who looked like a psychopath and fought like one too. 11:47 p.m, June 5th. Jake's C-47 lifted off from England. Destination: Drop Zone Alpha near Carentan, France. The plan was elementary: jump at 1,000 feet, consolidate with other paratroopers, secure bridges and road intersections to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the invasion beaches. 1:23 a.m, June 6th. Jake's aircraft crossed the French coastline. German anti-aircraft fire erupted immediately. 88mm flak 37mm cannons tracer rounds illuminating the night sky. The C-47 shook violently. Jake's jumpmaster ordered everyone to stand and hook static lines. 1:26 a.m. An 88mm shell struck the C-47's fuel tank. The explosion tore through the aircraft fuselage. Fuel ignited. The plane's tail section separated. Men who hadn't exited yet were ejected into the night sky without pulling ripcords. Jake was standing in the door when the plane detonated. The blast threw him backward. His static line deployed his parachute automatically. He fell 1,500 feet through burning debris and anti-aircraft fire. His parachute opened, barely. One panel was burning. 2 others were shredded. Jake hit the ground hard. Landed in a flooded field, went underwater. His gear dragged him down. He cut his parachute harness, surfaced, gasped for air. Around him, chaos. Planes burning. Parachutes drifting into German positions. Gunfire everywhere. Jake pulled his rifle from the water, checked his ammunition, began searching for his men. By dawn, Jake had located 9 members of the Filthy 13. 4 were confirmed dead. The rest were scattered across Normandy, but 9 men was sufficient. Jake gathered his survivors, explained the mission. They were assigned to secure a bridge at Chef du Pont. The bridge crossed the Meurdere River, critical for blocking German reinforcements. The problem was mathematical. Jake had 9 men. Intelligence indicated the Germans had at least 200 soldiers defending the area. Jake's solution was simpler. Attack anyway. 6:34 a.m, June 6th. Jake and his 9 paratroopers attacked German positions around Chef du Pont. They employed the same tactics Jake had learned poaching in Oklahoma. Move silently, use cover, strike fast, vanish. The Germans weren't anticipating 9 men attacking 200. Jake's squad moved through hedgerows, established ambushes, exploited German confusion. By 9 a.m., additional American paratroopers had linked up with Jake's group. His 9 men became 35. By 11 a.m., they'd captured the bridge at Chef du Pont. The Germans retreated, regrouped, prepared counterattack. 2:17 p.m., German artillery began impacting the bridge. Jake and his men dug in, fortified positions, prepared to hold. 4:43 p.m., American P-47 fighters appeared overhead. Jake's men waved, signaled, attempted to identify themselves as friendly forces. The P-47 circled, then bombed the bridge. American aircraft bombing American paratroopers because someone at headquarters believed the bridge was still German-held. The bombs destroyed the bridge Jake's men had spent all day capturing. Jake watched his bridge collapse into the Murderette River. Watched the mission he'd risked 35 lives to complete turn into rubble. Then he started laughing. Because of course the Air Force would bomb their own troops. Of course the Army would destroy the bridge they'd ordered paratroopers to capture. Jake's men looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Jake explained the situation with clarity. They'd just captured a bridge the Army no longer needed. So now they were stranded behind German lines with no mission, no supplies, and no way home. Might as well make the Germans regret it. Jake repositioned his men on high ground overlooking the destroyed bridge, established machine gun positions, prepared defensive lines. If the Germans wanted the crossing, they'd have to come through 35 paratroopers who had nothing left to lose. But Jake didn't just dig in randomly. He understood something about defensive warfare that most officers never learned. Terrain decides battles, not numbers. The high ground overlooking the destroyed bridge had 3 natural choke points, narrow approaches where attacking forces would compress, perfect kill zones. Jake positioned his .30 caliber machine guns to cover those choke points with overlapping fields of fire. Any German soldier attempting to advance would receive fire from multiple angles simultaneously. He placed his best riflemen in elevated positions with clear sight lines, told them to target German officers and COS first, kill the leadership in the attack collapses. He positioned his bar gunners to suppress German support weapons, machine gun teams, mortar crews, anything that could provide covering fire for German infantry. And he maintained a mobile reserve of 5 men. Their mission: plug holes. If Germans broke through anywhere, the reserve would counterattack immediately. Jake explained the plan to his 35 men, told them the truth. No reinforcements coming, no supplies, no escape. The bridge was gone, the mission was over. But 700 Germans were about to attack, and Jake's men could either surrender or make those Germans pay for every inch of ground. His paratroopers chose to fight. Jake gave them one final instruction: conserve ammunition, make every shot count. The Germans had unlimited supplies. Jake's men had whatever they'd carried from the landing zone. If they ran out of bullets, they'd lose. Simple as that. The men settled into positions, checked weapons, waited. June 7th, 8 a.m. German scouts approached the destroyed bridge, observed American paratroopers dug in on high ground, reported back. June 8th. The Germans probed Jake's defences. Small squad-level attacks testing American positions. Jake's men killed them all. June 9th, 7:22 a.m. The German officer arrived with his white flag. 700 soldiers, multiple machine gun positions, artillery support. The Germans possessed overwhelming force. The officer dismounted his horse, approached Jake, demanded surrender. Jake was out of food, out of water. His men had been consuming grass and drinking from puddles. But Jake McNiece had survived a plane explosion, swam out of a flooded field, captured a bridge, watched his own Air Force destroy it, and spent 3 days under German fire. He was not in the mood to surrender. Jake told the German officer to attack if he wished, but he should understand that Jake's 35 paratroopers were dug into fortified positions on high ground with overlapping fields of fire, and they'd been eating grass for 3 days, which had made them extremely irritable. The German officer said Jake's position was hopeless. Reinforcements weren't coming, supplies weren't coming. Surrender was the logical choice. Jake said logic was for people who hadn't just watched their own Air Force bomb them. The German officer returned to his lines. 9:14 a.m. The German attack began. 700 soldiers advancing uphill, machine guns firing, artillery falling on American positions. Jake's men waited. Let the Germans commit. Let them compress on the approaches. The Germans moved in 3 waves. First wave, 200 infantry. Second wave, another 200 with machine gun support. Third wave, 300 in reserve. Standard German assault doctrine: overwhelm the defence with superior numbers. It should have worked. The first German wave hit the narrow choke points exactly as Jake predicted. Soldiers bunched together on the approach trails, perfect targets. Jake waited until they were 100 yards out, then gave the order to fire. 35 paratroopers, every weapon they possessed. M1 Garans, BARs, machine guns, grenades. The effect was catastrophic. The 30 caliber machine guns opened first, 500 rounds per minute each, tracers reaching down the slope. German soldiers fell in groups. The riflemen followed, disciplined, aimed shots. Jake's men had trained for months to shoot fast and accurate. Now that training paid dividends, German soldiers fell, their advance stalled, men dove for cover that didn't exist. The bar gunners suppressed German machine gun teams attempting to establish support positions. The Germans couldn't establish a base of fire, couldn't provide covering fire for their infantry. Without covering fire, German infantry was exposed, advancing uphill into concentrated American defensive fire. The first wave collapsed within minutes. Bodies accumulated on the slope. Wounded soldiers screaming. The survivors retreated down the hill. Jake's men had fired for maybe 3 minutes. German casualties, at least 40 dead or wounded. American casualties, 0. The Germans regrouped, tried again at 11 a.m. This time they brought mortars, started dropping rounds on Jake's positions before the infantry advanced. The mortar barrage was heavy, explosions walking across the American defensive line, shrapnel tearing through trees. But Jake had positioned his men in defilade behind the crest of the hill. The mortar rounds were falling on the forward slope, not the reverse slope where his men were dug in. The barrage looked impressive, sounded terrifying, accomplished nothing. When the mortars stopped, German infantry advanced again. Same result. Jake's machine guns cut them down. His riflemen picked off anyone who got close. The bar gunners suppressed German support weapons. The second wave lasted 5 minutes before collapsing. German casualties, another 50, dead or wounded. American casualties, still 0. 2:30 p.m. The Germans brought up artillery, started shelling Jake's positions directly. Jake's men hunkered down, survived the barrage, waited. 4 p.m. The Germans attacked again, this time with tank support. 2 Panzer IVs, 75mm main guns, machine guns, thick armour that M1 Garand bullets couldn't penetrate. Jake's men had no bazookas, no anti-tank weapons, no method to kill armour. The army had promised anti-tank weapons would be delivered after the drop. Never happened. The tanks rumbled up the road toward Jake's position. German infantry following close behind, using the tanks for cover. Jake watched through his binoculars, assessed the situation. The tanks were advancing on the main road, the only approach wide enough for armour. The road ran through a narrow defile between 2 hills. Perfect ambush site. But Jake couldn't ambush the tanks. He could only ambush the infantry. He repositioned 2 machine gun teams, told them to ignore the tanks completely. Focus all fire on German infantry. When the tanks reached the defile, Jake's machine guns opened up, not at the tanks, at the soldiers walking behind them. German infantry scattered, due for cover, stopped advancing. The tanks kept moving, but without infantry support they were vulnerable. Not vulnerable to Jake's weapons, vulnerable to terrain. The road through the defile was narrow, steep embankments on both sides. The tanks had to stay on the road or risk getting stuck. And staying on the road meant they couldn't manoeuvre, couldn't flank, couldn't achieve firing angles on Jake's positions. The tanks fired their main guns, 75mm shells screaming into the hillside, explosions tearing up dirt and trees. But Jake's men were dug in on the reverse slope. The tank rounds were impacting the forward slope, close enough to feel, too far away to kill. The tanks couldn't elevate their guns high enough to hit Jake's positions. The angle was too steep. So the tanks just sat there, firing uselessly into the hillside while Jake's men killed every German soldier who tried to support them. After 30 minutes the tanks retreated, out of targets, out of infantry support. Jake's defensive plan had worked perfectly. The terrain negated German armour. The choke points negated German numbers. American casualties still 0. By nightfall on June 9th, the Germans had launched 5 major attacks. Every attack failed. German casualties, at least 127 dead, hundreds wounded. American casualties 0. June 10th, dawn. American reinforcements finally arrived. Elements of the 82nd Airborne. They'd fought their way through German lines to reach Jake's position. The relief force commander found Jake and his 35 men still holding the high ground. Asked for a status report. Jake said they were out of food, out of water, and out of patience. But the Germans hadn't taken the position. The commander asked how many casualties Jake had sustained. Jake said 0. The commander didn't believe him, thought Jake was in shock, asked again. Jake repeated, 0 casualties. Then he asked if the relief force had brought any food because his men were tired of eating grass. The army eventually pieced together what had happened. 35 paratroopers had held a destroyed bridge against 700 Germans for 72 hours. 0 friendly casualties, over 100 German dead. Nobody knew what to do with that information. Jake McNiece should have received a Medal of Honor, should have been promoted, should have been recognized. Instead, he received a Bronze Star and orders to report for his next mission. Because the army had learned something important about Jake McNiece, he was too good at killing to waste on promotions and ceremonies. By December 1944, Jake had survived 6 months of combat in France. The Filthy 13 were down to 4 original members. The rest were dead, wounded, or transferred. December 16th. Germany launched a massive counter-offensive through the Ardennes forest, the Battle of the Bulge. German forces surrounded the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, Belgium. 11,000 American soldiers completely cut off. No supplies, no reinforcements. The army needed someone to jump into a surrounded city and establish radio equipment to call in resupply drops. They asked for volunteers. Jake McNiece raised his hand. December 18th, 3:47 a.m. Jake and 9 other Pathfinders loaded into C-47 transports. Their mission, parachute into Bastogne, establish radio contact, coordinate resupply drops. The weather was terrible, heavy fog, 0 visibility, German anti-aircraft positions surrounding the city. The C-47 pilot said the mission was suicide. No way to see the drop zone, no way to avoid flak. Jake said that was fine. He'd survived worse. 7:23 a.m. Jake's plane reached Bastogne. The pilot couldn't see the ground, couldn't see the city. Just white fog and occasional German tracer fire. The jumpmaster told Jake to jump anyway. Jake jumped into fog at 1,000 feet with no idea where he'd land. His parachute opened. He fell through clouds, hit the ground hard. He was in the middle of Bastogne, surrounded by American soldiers from the 101 Saint who were shocked to see anyone parachuting in. Jake asked where the German positions were. A sergeant pointed in every direction, said the Germans had the city surrounded. Jake asked where his other Pathfinders had landed. The sergeant said 3 had landed inside the American perimeter. The rest landed outside, probably captured or killed. Jake refused to accept that. Spent the next 2 hours searching the city, dodging German fire, finding scattered Pathfinders. By 9 a.m., he'd found 8 of his 10 men. 2 confirmed dead. 8 Pathfinders was enough. Jake split his team into 2 groups, one on the east side of Bastogne, one on the west. Each team set up radio equipment, started bouncing signals back and forth to prevent Germans from triangulating their position. 10:17 a.m., Jake made his first radio call, Bastogne to Allied Command. Americans still holding. Request immediate resupply drop. Allied Command responded within seconds. Said they'd send C-47s immediately. 11:34 a.m. The first resupply drop arrived. 1 C-47 flying low through heavy clouds. German flak opened up. The plane dropped supply bundles, food, ammunition, medical supplies. The bundles landed inside the American perimeter. The C-47 survived and flew away. Jake called in another drop, then another, then another. For the next 24 hours, Jake's Pathfinder teams coordinated continuous resupply drops. The weather was terrible, visibility near 0, German flak constant. But the C-47s kept coming. Pilots flying blind based entirely on Jake's radio coordinates. By December 20th, 10:17 a.m., Jake's team had called in 247 successful resupply drops. 247 planes, thousands of pounds of supplies, everything the 101st needed to keep fighting. When General Patton's Third Army broke through German lines on December 26th, the 101st Airborne was still fighting, still holding Bastogne. The Battle of the Bulge ended because Bastogne didn't fall. Bastogne didn't fall because Jake McNiece jumped into a surrounded city and called in 247 resupply drops, while Germans tried to kill him. The army didn't give Jake a medal for Bastogne. Pathfinder operations were classified. But Jake didn't care. He'd kept 11,000 American soldiers alive. That was enough. After Germany surrendered in May 1945, Jake and the 101st occupied Germany. They found Hermann Göring's abandoned castle, expensive liquor, stolen racehorses. Jake and his men threw a rodeo, drank Göring's liquor, rode his horses through a massive party. During the party, Jake met a German woman named Amelia, started dating her, found out later her father was the leader of the local Hitler Youth chapter. Jake thought that was hilarious. The army eventually sent Jake home to Arkansas for medical treatment. While there, Jake got in another fight with military police. This time he threatened the MP commander, said once he was a civilian he'd come back and settle things properly. The army decided Jake McNiece was more trouble than he was worth. They discharged him. Honourable discharge. 3 years, 5 months, 26 days of service, 4 combat jumps, hundreds of confirmed kills, multiple impossible missions completed, never promoted past private. Jake returned to Oklahoma, struggled with alcoholism for several years, then had a near-fatal drunk driving accident. The alcoholism wasn't random. Jake had killed hundreds of men, watched friends die, survived situations that should have killed him. And when he came home, nobody understood. Nobody wanted to hear about Chef DuPont or Bastogne, what it felt like to watch your plane explode at 1,500 feet. They wanted the war to be over, wanted Jake to go back to being normal. But Jake wasn't normal. He'd spent 4 years as a weapon. The army had pointed him at Germans and he'd killed them efficiently and without hesitation. Now the army was done with him, and Jake had no idea how to be anything except a killer. So he drank, because drinking made the memories quieter, made the nightmares less frequent. The drunk driving accident happened in 1951. Jake wrapped his car around a telephone pole outside Ponca City. Fractured skull, broken ribs. The doctor said he should have died. Jake woke up in the hospital 3 days later, looked at himself, realized he was destroying the life he'd fought so hard to come home to. That night, Jake found God. Not in a dramatic vision, not in a moment of divine intervention. Jake just decided that if he'd survived a plane explosion, multiple German attacks and a drunk driving accident, maybe someone was trying to tell him something. He quit drinking that week, never touched alcohol again, got married 6 months later, Mary Catherine, Oklahoma girl. She knew Jake had served, knew he'd been a paratrooper, didn't know the details. Jake never told her, never told anyone. He got a job at the Ponca City post office, started selling stamps, sorting mail, living a quiet life, had 3 children, raised them well, coached a little league, went to church every Sunday, became the kind of man who'd never broken a sergeant's nose over butter, never shot MPs' pistols into street signs, never told a German officer to attack uphill into machine gun positions. His children knew their father had served in World War II. They didn't know he'd been the army's worst discipline problem and most effective killer. Jake kept it that way intentionally. Because he didn't want his children growing up thinking war was glorious, didn't want them idolizing violence. War had been necessary. Jake had been good at it, but it wasn't something to celebrate. He spent the rest of his life working at the Ponca City post office, selling stamps, sorting mail. Nobody at the post office knew Jake had survived a plane explosion on D-Day. Nobody knew he'd held off 700 Germans with 35 men. Nobody knew he'd saved Bastogne. Jake never talked about it. He lived quietly, raised his family, went to church, died in 2013 at age 93. The army tried to kick him out 8 times during training. He survived D-Day when his plane exploded, captured a bridge and held it against 700 Germans for 72 hours with 0 casualties, jumped into surrounded Bastogne and called in 247 resupply drops, that saved 11,000 American soldiers. And then he spent 40 years selling stamps in Oklahoma, which is exactly what he wanted. Because Jake McNiece never wanted to be famous. He never wanted medals or promotions or recognition. He wanted to kill Nazis, eat breakfast, and go home. He accomplished all three. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who care about the heroes who got forgotten. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing these stories from archives and obscurity every single week. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here.